and looking at enterprise funds as part of our continued discussion of Chapter 7, proprietary funds. So when a government must use an enterprise fund under GASB standards, so we have that the activity is financed with debt that is secured solely by a pledge of the revenues from fees and charges of an activity. Laws or regulations require that the activity's costs of providing services, including all capital costs, be recovered with fees and charges rather than with taxes, and pricing policies are designed to recover the cost of the activity, including capital costs. So if any of these things are not true, so for example, the activity is financed with debt that is secured from other activities, then the government does not have to use an enterprise fund. They can, but they don't have to. They could just use a special revenue fund. So enterprise is specifically a business type activity. And because they are business type activities, they use accrual basis of accounting. They include all assets used in the activity as well as long-term debt serviced by the activity. Public utilities are the most common example of enterprise funds. So the example in your book and thus in these PowerPoint slides is of a public utility, specifically a water utility. Government business type activities generally have investor-owned counterparts and can take advantage of the accounting structures developed in the private sector. For example, if the government has a state-owned airport, so it's a state-owned, government-run enterprise fund airport, there are also privately owned or corporately owned airports. So that's what that sentence is stating. Therefore, governmental business type activities can take advantage of the accounting structures already developed for airports in general. Additionally, they can then do benchmarking and other comparisons of themselves to industry operations. The Water Utility Fund is the example used in the textbook because utility funds are the most common. Okay, water specifically is regulated by the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissions and Federal Energy Regulatory Commissions, so all utility funds. In addition, that if operated as a utility fund, they have to follow GASB rules. Okay, because of these two separate regulations surrounding utilities, there is some unique terminology associated with accounting for utilities. Okay, and that's this terminology here, which then is explained in much further detail in the Chapter 7 reading. So the additional terminology we have is accrued utilities revenue. So this is revenue that hasn't been billed yet as an result of cycle billing. So this recognizes that people are using the utility every single day and that they're eventually going to be billed for that revenue but haven't been billed yet. Okay. Restricted assets. So this is because customers deposit. So customers deposit for utilities, and so that cash that's being held for a return when a customer moves outside of the city limits and gets rid of their utility, their deposit gets returned, so that cash is restricted. Additionally, anything that's restricted because we have a bond debt service. Okay. Are the source of our supply. So for example, if we're electricity utility, where do we get our electricity? What assets do we own as part of that utility service? Utility lines, poles, where is it located? What land rights do we have for the land that we have utility poles on, for example? Same thing with the water utilities. Where are we getting our water? What land and land rights do we have? What are the structures improvements? How are we getting water into people's individual houses and businesses? And what part of the water service line do we own? So for example, water that comes into your house has plumbing underneath your house that connects to plumbing under the street that is owned by the city. So there's a city-owned infrastructure as part of that water line, and then there's a property owner as part of that water line. Customer advances for construction. So advances received from customers to complete construction activities requested by those customers. This can be a wide variety of things and depends on what the thing is. But for example, if we were putting in a brand new development within a city, so a new housing development, we're building houses, we are going to have to complete construction and we're going to have city utilities there. So sometimes you might see land for sale that says utilities are already established, in which you don't have to worry about getting the city to put utilities in, or you'll see land for sale that says this land does not have utilities yet. In that case, you would need to go to the city and say, I need the city to build utilities to this property. Okay. And then any liabilities payable and restricted assets. So that would be those customer deposits and bond revenues, and then long-term liabilities if we have any bonds that have financed any part of our operations and capital assets. So these transactions here are an example of transactions that our water utility enterprise fund would have. As you can see, these are not recorded in the governmental activities. So it's a little bit different from an inter-fund service or an inter-service fund in that it's not part of the governmental activities. Enterprise funds are accounted for separately, reported separately, and they are reported on the government-wide activities section as business type activities is where you would find the enterprise fund transactions, but you will see that there are not any government activities transactions here. Of course, all of these individual transactions are described in further detail in Chapter 7, and I'm not going to read through each one of these transactions separately or describe what they are. But you can see that we get money in from sales of water, we have contributions from customers, and then the various expenses that we have as a part of operating that water utility. The financial statements for government entities include a statement of net position, statement of revenues, expenses, and changes in fund net position, and a statement of cash flows. Of course, again, where those financial statements have to follow GASB rules, and that statement of cash flows has to use the direct method of reporting. And as I said before, enterprise funds are included in the business type activities column in the government-wide financial statements. Okay, and that is the Chapter 7 discussion of proprietary funds, the two different funds being internal service funds and enterprise funds, which are business type activities of a government.